Well, here's another unique special operation for Ukraine's collection. The security service of Ukraine attacked the Crimean bridge for the third time today, and now the structure is in an emergency condition. It is reported that agents of the security service of Ukraine have mined the supports of the overpass, which was illegally built by the Russian Federation. And as a result, today, on June 3rd, without any civilian casualties, at 4:44 in the morning, the first explosive device was activated. I emphasize this first because the Crimean bridge was later attacked again. Russians are panicking right now because it's obvious that the security service of Ukraine will not stop there. As I mentioned in previous episodes, when there were attacks on airfields, I hinted that this is just the beginning. Well, today Ukrainian officials are openly saying that yes, the Crimean bridge is simply the next target for such massive attacks, and they emphasize that this operation was also prepared for quite a long time, hinting that there are still several operations that we will see in the future. In this episode, we will discuss with you what is happening with the Crimean bridge right now, and we will also discuss some of the results of the strikes on Russian airfields. Because now there is already new information, new details about how many aircraft were hit, and whether it is possible to repeat such a special operation on the territory of Russia. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is June 3rd. Let's go over everything in order, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like and write your comment. This is very important so that the algorithms promote this episode to a larger audience. Also subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechi News, the link to it is in the description of this video. Let's review everything step by step. The security service of Ukraine today blew up the Crimean bridge underwater, and now the structure is in an emergency condition. I'll begin with the SSU's official statement, followed by some of the details. It is noted that the operation lasted several months. In particular, SSU agents mined the supports of the pipeline that was illegally constructed by the Russian Federation. Consequently, on June 3rd at 4:44 anti-meridium, the initial explosive was detonated. According to the SSU, the underwater supports of the pillars were severely damaged at the bottom level. 1,100 kilograms of explosives in trinitrotoluene equivalent contributed to this. In fact, the bridge is in an emergency condition. The head of the Security Service of Ukraine, Lieutenant General Vasily Malyuk, personally supervised the operation and coordinated its planning. Today, Malyuk stated, "God loves the Trinity, and the Security Service of Ukraine always completes its plans without repetition. Earlier, we struck the Crimean bridge twice, in 2022 and 2023. Therefore, today we continue this tradition, but this time underwater. There is no place for any illegal objects of the Russian Federation on the territory of our state. Therefore, the Crimean bridge is an absolutely legitimate target, especially considering that the enemy used it as a logistical artery to supply their troops. Crimea is Ukraine, and any manifestations of occupation will receive our tough response." Well, now let's move on to the details that are currently known from open sources. In particular, according to one version, the bridge could have been hit today by our underwater drone called Morichka, which is capable of covering a distance of 1,000 kilometers. Videos of the underwater drone tests have already surfaced online. Continued. On the other hand, this version is still questioned because the Security Service of Ukraine claims that explosives were planted. Here are those very supports of the bridge. And here we move on to the next point. What kind of supports are these, the supports of the Crimean bridge? And here it's important to say how the Crimean bridge is actually constructed. In this picture, an arrow points to the place where most likely the explosion happened today. And judging by the photos from the scene, it's the outer side of the automobile section of the bridge. The Security Service of Ukraine writes that 1,100 kilograms of explosives were detonated at the bottom level. And that's exactly where the so-called main supports of this bridge are hidden. That is, if you see a lot of poles there on which basically further down at the bottom of the Black and Azov Seas, the Crimean bridge itself is held up. Accordingly, if these supports were indeed damaged, we can state that repairing this damage will be very difficult. Moreover, if you look at the site of the explosion, if my eyesight isn't failing me, the explosion happened right in these places shown in the photographs. This is a very sensitive spot for the Crimean bridge. If it was the underwater supports that were damaged, then restoring them will be very, very difficult. Well, at the same time, Russians started complaining that the Crimean bridge was under attack again, but we'll get back to that later. The only thing I'll note here is that while Russians were in shock over the explosion on the Crimean bridge, reports started appearing in Crimean social media about explosions in Feodosia and air defense activity at the Belbek airfield. So this was a kind of combined attack. Well, next, we'll move on to the question of that very special operation, Pautin, which preceded the explosion on the Crimean bridge. The thing is, right now, many experts, for example, are noting that the dormant drones from the special operation Pautin could attack again. That is, it is not ruled out that Ukraine has actually transferred many more of those very first-person view drones into Russian territory, the same ones that attacked Russian airfields the other day. And these first-person view drones could be in such a dormant mode, just waiting for their moment. As it is written, Ukraine carried out an attack that could change the rules of war, and not just for Russia. The new approach used by the Security Service of Ukraine for the strike on 4 military airfields in Russia has taken drone attack tactics to a completely new level. This is an attack, a window into future warfare. Let me remind you, according to the Security Service of Ukraine, Ukrainian operatives smuggled drones into Russian territory. The drones were hidden in wooden structures that resembled small houses. In this form, they were placed on trucks that drove as close as possible to the airfields Belaya, Diaghilevo, Olenia, and Ivanovo. After remotely opening the roofs, the drones took off and hit their targets. According to preliminary estimates, up to 41 aircraft were damaged, with losses reaching up to $7 billion. Unlike previous drone attacks from a long distance, the new operation is focused on minimizing the route to the target. The drones were actually launched directly from Russian territory, bypassing the S-300 and S-400 systems. And as many experts are now saying, this is a tremendous success for the Ukrainian special services. The scale and ingenuity of this attack show that Ukraine is now less dependent on Western support. The strike was carried out without noticeable logistical or intelligence assistance from the Allies. The farthest of the targeted airfields, Belaya in Irkutsk Oblast, is located more than 2,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Before this attack, Ukrainian drones had only managed to reach a maximum distance of 1,100 kilometers. That is, Russia has lost its sense of security even in its deepest rear areas. It is noted that even if half of the destroyed aircraft are Tu-95 and Tu-160 bombers, this will significantly reduce Russia's ability to launch cruise missiles at Ukrainian targets. Most of the aircraft were parked in open areas. Russia tried to use improvised camouflage measures, in particular, placing tires on the wings, but this did absolutely nothing to prevent the attack. The lack of shelters is not just a problem for Russia. In the United States, for example, the modern air fleet also lacks a sufficient number of hangars to protect aircraft. And here's where it gets really interesting. Ukraine does not disclose exactly how it transported drones into the territory of the Russian Federation, but this points to the vulnerability of Russian logistics. And here Karl Rosender, this co-founder, warns that this is most likely just the beginning. Drones, as he says, can remain dormant on enemy territory and be activated at the most vulnerable moment. And this tactic can be used against other countries, including NATO. Supposedly now all of Ukraine's allies absolutely must learn from this experience. At the same time, today, the head of the communications department of the Air Force Command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Yuri Inat, stated that after the security service of Ukraine's spiderweb operation at air bases deep in the rear, the occupiers will not be able to carry out terrorist attacks against Ukraine for a long time. He specifically mentions that June 1st has turned into a dark day for Russian aviation. The security service of Ukraine operation is very significant for the further development of the war. And now I will quote Ignat. The modernized A-50s in Russia could be counted on the fingers of one hand. In Russia, they could be counted on the fingers of one hand. Thanks to them, Russia conducted powerful radar reconnaissance deep into Ukraine for hundreds of kilometers. This gave the enemy information about the presence of our aircraft in the air, about air attacks, as well as about our air defense systems. The loss of even one such aircraft is already a major event. But in addition, we have attacked airfields. For a long time, they won't be able to carry out terrorist acts across the territory of Ukraine. Since the first days of the full-scale invasion, the enemy has used carrier aircraft of strategic aviation, two 22 M3 long-range aviation, two 95 and two 160 strategic aviation. It was from these carriers that the enemy launched 2,437 101 Ka 555 and Ka 55 cruise missiles at Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Of these, 1,916 were shot down, while a significant number, about 500, reached their targets or were not intercepted. Well, in this way, Inat is hinting that these were indeed quite important targets to strike. At the same time, Ukrainian Prime Minister Dmytro Denis Shmyhal stated that this was not just an isolated incident. And he noted that this operation was necessary against the backdrop of failed negotiations and increased Russian strikes on peaceful cities. Well, I'll go ahead and quote him further. We have been proposing a complete ceasefire for 2 months now, but the Russians still do not agree. They continue to attack Ukraine every night, with constant missile and drone attacks on civilian infrastructure happening daily. That's why we had no choice. We must destroy their military potential and not allow them to do this. Pautin proves that innovation and new technologies play a decisive role in this war. Technologies are changing the battlefield. Moreover, he states that Ukraine has many other ideas to improve this capability. Then he noted, quote, "This is not just an episode. This can happen again. We continue to work hard. You can already see the results in the Black Sea, and we are liberating our airspace from Russian bombers." And here we return to the topic of the Crimean bridge. The thing is, right now, Russian public channels, after the undermining of the Crimean bridge support pillar, are claiming that the Crimean bridge is under attack again. In particular, the attack is coming from the sea, and Russians are complaining that unidentified surface objects are now breaking through the defenses of the Crimean bridge and heading toward the illegal structure. Therefore, most likely, this is just the beginning, and the SSU has prepared many similar special operations that we may witness in the coming days. So my friends, I'll stop here for the moment. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and don't forget to leave a like.